thoughts. Analog thoughts.
Analog thoughts.
Analog thoughts. Analog thoughts.
Analog thoughts.
Analog thoughts.
Analog thoughts.
How are we? How are we feeling? How are we doing? Take a deep breath and just marinate on how you're feeling right now. Take a pause, take a moment, whatever you're doing, just take a quick little pause, see where you're at, feel it out, check it out. Are you feeling okay? I just watched this animated movie called Klaus, and it was so good. I cannot recommend it enough. The main character kind of had like the character dynamics kind of had an Emperor's New Groove vibe to them. So if you like that movie, I feel like you'd really like Klaus. It's on Netflix. It just really hit harder than I anticipated. The plot, the character development, I laughed, I cried. It checked all the boxes. And I was like, dang, I was just looking, I was looking for just a fun, kind of silly movie to fall asleep to. And I stayed up and watched the whole thing and was just captivated. I think it came out in 2019, so it's relatively new relatively new in terms of Christmas movies anyway. But I get ahead of myself. If you're, hi. If you're new to the podcast, I'm Steven. This is Analog Thoughts. Welcome. Happy holidays. At the beginning of the podcast, I've been giving some life updates. Right now, I'm just going to keep my updates I'm going to keep my updates around watch Klaus. If you're looking for like a deep, emotional, animated movie that is really well done, I can't recommend it enough. I've been thrust into the corporate tsunami of buying gifts. I didn't buy any gifts up until a couple days ago, and then I went out and shopped for everyone I needed to get gifts for, and it took like an entire day. I'm still not done, but I'm closer than I was before I started. And isn't that just the true meaning of Christmas? Just buy it all, buy it up, buy now. Anyway, enough about me, enough about my updates. My son Felix is doing great. He is loving our Christmas tree. We ask him to identify the ornaments on the Christmas tree. I say, like, point out the elephants or point out the kitty, and he'll do it. It's the cutest thing in the world. For Christmas, don't tell him. Please do not tell him. Keep it closed. Keep it, don't let him know. But his big Christmas present this year is a big wheel with a light up wheel. I'm really excited for him to unwrap it. He's thriving. I love him. Happy holidays to him, really. If you can't tell, I have been a little disenchanted about the Christmas seasons so far. Not disenchanted. Every year, I hit this wall of holiday blues, and I think I'm hitting it. I think I'm getting there, and I don't want to seem like a Grinch or a Scrooge or that I'm not, like, feeling the season, but I think we all eventually hit this wall where we're like, okay, let's just bring in 2025 and get 2024 behind us. We're ready for a new rebirth. We're ready for something new to blossom and come forth. I learned about this thing today called kintsugi, and it is this, you've probably seen it before. It's this pottery thing. I don't know what it's this pottery art style where you shatter a plate or a bowl and you piece it back together with gold. So it initially has a crisis, it gets destroyed. And then it gets the elements of the crisis, the cracks and the fractures, the designers use those cracks and fractures to their advantage by sealing them up with gold. That's how we need to be looking at our situation, ending out 2024 and feeling like we're cracked and shattered. We need to use this explosion of emotions as a springboard for opportunity. And I invite you to take a look at what has gone right, what has gone wrong, what has gone unexpected ways, and try to think of how you can reformat the way you're looking at these things and reformat the way that you are approaching moving forward, and maybe think of these fractures or cracks in the dish as an opportunity to line them with gold and reform them in a new and interesting way. If you're like, what is he talking about with kintsugi? Just Google a picture, you'll see it, and you'll be like, oh, that. I think it's a good metaphor for what I'm trying to explain, what I'm trying to put forward. Taking your fractured experience, whatever that may be, and looking at it as an opportunity. Also, for this episode, you might notice my voice is a little raspy. It's because I've been smoking for 60 years. No, I'm just kidding. Obviously, I just have a little bit of something going on with my nose and my throat, but I'm still going to do the episode. I'm not going to let that keep me down. We're going to move forward and make it happen. Let's get into why you're here. The 1914 Christmas truce that happened during World War I, in the midst of all of this holiday blues that we're feeling, I felt like this was and I don't know if you're feeling the holiday blues like I am, but I feel like a lot of people who are alive. I feel like a lot of people are. I feel like a lot of people are going through it in one way or another, in some capacity. So I thought that today's topic could bring some light, could shine a light, and really give us some perspective on looking at how things could always be much worse. And not only could things be much worse, we have the capacity to shine even in the darkest of circumstances. That's why I picked today's topic. If you don't know a ton about World War I, that's okay. You don't need to know a ton to truly appreciate today's episode. Also, just a quick note, I'm going to use the terms armistice and truce today. They are slightly different things, but just for the sake of keeping things fluid, I'm going to kind of use them interchangeably. An armistice is a formal agreement between warring parties to stop hostilities, usually as a preliminary step to a more comprehensive peace treaty. And a truce is a temporary and less formal ceasefire or cessation of fighting, often agreed upon for specific purposes like recovering the wounded, negotiating, or observing a holiday. Just know that truce and armistice are temporary peace slash ceasefire or cease hostility agreements. And they both just mean, we're going to stop fighting for now. There's going to be an agreement to stop fighting for now. I won't get into all the nuts and bolts that caused World War I. I feel like that might merit an entire episode. But all you really need to know is it was brutal. It was war. It was raw. And conditions were very harsh. There was a lot of trench warfare. And this trench warfare primarily took place on the Western Front, which stretched across northern France and Belgium. And this, of course, was between the Allied forces, which were France, Britain, and later the US, against Germany. And the Allied forces were other forces as well, but for the sake of this episode, I'm going to be focusing on the French, British, and U.S. forces, and the Indian British forces as well. So we're talking World War I. We're talking very gnarly stuff. You've seen it in movies or read about it in books. A bunch of soldiers lived in trenches for long periods of time, poking their heads out to fire or ducking in to avoid artillery. And at the same time, weaponry like machine guns and artillery led to a stalemate where both sides dug trenches for protection. And they also dug the trenches to hinder large-scale ground advances from either side. And between the trenches, there was this bit in the middle. The land between the trenches was known as no man's land. And basically, if you went there, if you got out of your trench and went there, you died. That's where this magical event that we're going to talk about today, this magical event on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, happened, where for just a brief moment, these two battling sides put their weapons aside and celebrated Christmas. And now you can kind of see why I'm getting into this today, because of my of my somewhat disenchantment with the season. I felt like we needed to bring some light. We needed to talk about a literal Christmas miracle today to bring us back to where we needed to be. There's a lot of speculation as to how exactly this all went down, but it did happen. There were pictures of it, there were soldiers that wrote letters home about it, and various other pieces of history that historians use to paint this whole picture, to paint this whole scene. I'd just like to say that there's a bit more to it, to all of this, than pure human spirit and holiday cheer and warm fuzzies, although the warm fuzzies did play a big role, and I'm going to get into all of those reasons. So let's get into some of the factors that led to a ceasefire in no man's land on that magical Christmas Eve. Before this fabled Christmas Eve, both sides of the trenches had become accustomed to the rhythms of trench warfare. There were some periods of peace that were already mutually agreed upon, like lunchtime or dinner time. The armies ate meals at the same time, which these times became daily ceasefire times. Also, patrols frequently ignored each other. The mentality was it was kind of like, hey, we could be on this patrol and both kill each other right now, or we could both just kind of keep walking and not kill each other. We could both live and let live, basically. So there were already these micro agreements, these micro truces going on between the trenches. And let me kind of paint a picture here of what this particular winter was like for this part of World War One in the trenches. It rained a lot, and soldiers would often trudge through water all day. You've probably heard of trench foot, where people's limbs would get amputated because they got so waterlogged and infected. The sides of the trenches would collapse a lot. And when the soldiers slept, they would have to stay on these boards that were mounted up off the ground, and they would lean on each other or lean on the side of the trenches themselves. It was very uncomfortable. It was cold, it was wet, there were low food supplies. It was just miserable. Both sides shared the common enemy of the weather. Weeks and weeks of rain made everything flooded, and everything was just mud. So not only were both sides fighting against each other, they were both fighting against the elements. They shared this common enemy. And eventually there was a British field marshal named Sir John French who noticed the hands-off attitude of his troops, how they were spending a ton of time just trying to survive rather than fighting the other side. So he decided, of course, as you do, he decided to order them to attack. And this, of course, resulted in heavy losses for British troops. So this real douche of a field marshal, Sir John French, also issued orders that no unofficial armistice would be tolerated. He saw that morale was low, and he knew that both sides were looking to just get some relief and hopefully not die from the elements. But he was like, nah, I don't care. I don't care how treacherous things are. Everyone keeps fighting. Everyone keeps killing. Elements be damned. Suck it up. That was basically his mentality. Over on the German side, commanders knew that this was a lot of German soldiers' first time away from home for the holidays. So the commanders brought in thousands of presents to keep morale high. They brought in cigarettes, pipes, drinks, meats, chocolates, all this stuff. And the British side, knew that presents, the commanders on the British side knew that presents were really important to morale as well. And their trenches were also full of soldiers who were having their first holiday from away from home too. So they also got presents like cigarettes, Christmas cards from Princess Mary. They got candies, new clothes, all this stuff. There were gifts from home as well on both sides. Again, cigarettes, treats, candies, wine, dried meats. And this was all well and good. Morale was raised from the presents. But the gifts were also somewhat cumbersome. You got to remember, these were flooded, cramped trenches, and they really didn't have anywhere to keep these gifts. So they were definitely a blessing, but they were also hard to keep from getting waterlogged and destroyed at the same time. And in the midst of all of this mud and turmoil and death and hardship, there was one gift that both sides got on that legendary Christmas Eve that they didn't have to store anywhere. After weeks, the rain stopped. The trenches drained and the muddy floors froze solid, giving soldiers something that somewhat resembled a hard floor. And many soldiers had new, fresh clothes from their presents from home. And for just a brief moment, things seemed a little less bleak. They were still bleak, obviously, but soldiers were dry. They had cigarettes, they had liquor, they had dried meats. It wasn't as bad as it was. And the Germans, full of meats and chocolates and liquors, they started to decorate the outside of their trenches with little trees and ornaments, and they started to sing. Over on the British side, they saw the lights from the trees, and at first they suspected an attack was imminent. But then they heard the singing, drifting across no man's land. They heard the Germans singing Silent Night. And the British decided, in true warfare fashion, that they would drown out the caroling with their own singing. And the two sides went back and forth, louder and louder. But soon the competition merged into a harmony. And I just want to take a second to talk about the power of music, the power of unified frequency. This is a prime example of that. And so the singing continued, and eventually the two sides started shouting Christmas greetings across no man's land to each other. And eventually soldiers and officers stepped out of the trenches and started to talk to the other side. Officers met along the barbed wire line that separated them and agreed that on Christmas Day there would be a ceasefire. You've got to keep in mind here, this was still a war zone, and not everyone got the memo all at once. Some unarmed soldiers were killed trying to broker this holiday armistice. It all didn't happen at once. And also, we aren't just talking British and German soldiers here, like I said earlier. For the most part, the Germans and British agreed to the ceasefire, but the French and the Belgians, whose countries were under German occupation at the time, weren't feeling these warm and fuzzy feelings so much. Even with the French and Germans not being on the same page so much as the British and Germans, they were still cordial to a degree. And I don't know if cordial is the right word for this, but they tolerated not killing each other for this armistice, for this truce. They didn't mingle so much, but they didn't outright kill each other. There was even reports of a French opera singer that made it into no man's land to sing during a French mass. I just think that the reality of that is really cool. An opera singer in the middle of no man's land on Christmas Day singing in the middle of a war. This is the only time in history that this sort of thing ever happened. And I talked about them earlier, but let's talk for a second about the British Indian troops. They were a bit unfamiliar with Christmas, but they understood that it meant something sacred and special to the troops and agreed to the ceasefire as well. There were actually reports that after being offered cigarettes and cigars and candies, that they made their way out of the trenches and joined in the festivities as well. And all the soldiers slept that Christmas Eve in silence. No gunshots or artillery, just much needed rest. The next day, the British side woke up and looked across no man's land. And they saw the Germans just walking around in broad daylight, something that would have been suicide under normal circumstances. And they trusted the truce, and the British also climbed out again, too. And the night before, on Christmas Eve, they weren't able to completely see all the bodies strewn about in no man's land. But during the day, it was impossible to ignore. There were bodies everywhere. And on Christmas Day, the two sides helped each other bury their dead in common graves, grieving side by side, crying side by side. And then they started exchanging gifts. Each side had a surplus of gifts, and they traded chocolates for cigarettes, German treats for British treats. They exchanged socks and hats, and one German soldier even gave haircuts to soldiers in need from both sides. And they also just talked. They were all young soldiers away from their homes, fighting for something they thought was right in wet, muddy, cramped trenches for a long time. They were going through it all in very similar ways. And both sides just had a genuine curiosity about who they were fighting. They'd been shooting at each other for so long, but they didn't really know what life was like on the other side, or who the people they were shooting at were, really. There were a lot of moments where both sides would come to the conclusion that they were fighting for freedom. The German and British sides both felt they were the good guys. And that's how war is. Both sides always think that they're the good guys, and it's wild what propaganda and brainwashing can do. So all the while, there were these two lieutenants from both sides that were talking. Turns out there were letters that the Germans got off a body that had fallen. They got off of a fallen British soldier that had fallen into a trench, and these letters were meant for his family. And the lieutenant from the German side returned these letters to the lieutenant from the British side. And the British lieutenant was so touched that he offered the German lieutenant his scarf. And the German lieutenant exchanged a pair of fur gloves his family had sent him. And not only was there this touching exchange, footballs were brought out into no man's land, and they played. They played sports. It was a battlefield turned into a joyous playground. There were also those that used this time to repair their trenches and spit shine the old machine guns, and because this was a war after all, so they were like, we have a little buffer's time to repair and get ready for the war that's going to happen again tomorrow. And even though a lot of people were on board with this, there were still many soldiers and officers that were not in favor of this truce, although they were greatly outnumbered. One of those officers that was against the truce was Adolf Hitler himself. He was quoted saying, "Such a thing should not happen in wartime. Have you no German sense of honor left at all?" Eventually, enough of a hubbub about the truce got through to enough higher up generals and all that, and they put out an order to cease the armistice. Officers from both sides saluted, fired their rifles into the air, and signaled that the fighting was back on. And that was the end of the 1914 World War I Christmas truce. And this Christmas ceasefire didn't happen again. Generals wouldn't allow it. The next year, on Christmas Eve 1915, British soldiers ordered a 24-hour artillery barrage, and soldiers who tried to form a truce were court-martialed. Machine guns drowned out Christmas carols. Part of the unwillingness to have the truce again was that in 1914, World War I was still relatively young. Soldiers hadn't seen the immense casualties, the use of new and deadlier weapons, and the other countless tragedies that the war would bring. And also, most of the soldiers that participated in the 1914 truce were dead by the Christmas of 1915. But for that brief Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, these two sides came together. They found common grounds, and they created a Christmas miracle. I love it. Let's get into the segment of the podcast I like to call Let's Ask AI. Let's ask AI. For today's question, I asked something really simple, something really basic, and honestly, I got a really simple answer back, and I love how short and sweet it is. I asked, what does a Christmas miracle truly mean? And AI answered, ultimately, a Christmas miracle is less about the what and more about the why. It reflects the transformative power of love, hope, and belief during a season where these virtues shine brightest. So well put. Thank you, AI. I just want to say, I'm not a Christian, and I also understand that Christmas is a Frankenstein of holidays and traditions lifted from ancient rituals, mostly pagan beliefs, but I think a lot of the magic in Christmas really works like the magic we imbue other things with. The magic is there because we say it is, because we believe it is. It's like a deck of tarot cards. They're really just rectangular pieces of cardboard, or they don't themselves hold any power. There's no magic there. The magic comes in when we assign magic to them. That's where the essence of the power comes from. That's where the beauty of it all happens. And that's where you can get really cool synchronicities and really cool miracles by believing that there is magic there. It doesn't inherently have any at all, but it's through the power of interacting with it. And I'm not just talking tarot here. I'm talking Christmas. I'm talking anything that we think can be a source of beauty and light and magic. It gets that because we believe it can have that. And I think that even in the midst of this terrible time of where we're at in humanity, not that it's all terrible, but there are really atrocious things going on in the world. And there are really hard moments that we all trudge through together. We're in the trenches together. I think that we all can find a sense of collective solace in knowing that we are able to have light and to bring light to whatever situation we find ourselves in. And I'm not saying you need to attach that light to Christmas or any holiday, but I think that Christmas can be a cool framework for rebirth and growth and understanding empathy and perspective. Let's do a couple fun facts and then we'll get out of here. Today I've been talking a lot about Christmas, and I wanted to do some fun facts about a different holiday and change the vibe up for a minute. So all of these fun facts I'm going to talk about today are about Kwanzaa. The first fun fact is that Kwanzaa was created in 1966 by Dr. Malwana Karenga, a professor and activist, as a way to celebrate African culture and heritage after the Watts riots in Los Angeles. Our next fun fact is that the word Kwanzaa is derived from the Swahili phrase Matunda ya Kwanzaa, which means first fruits. And Swahili was chosen because it's a widely spoken African language that represents unity. Our next fun fact is that Kwanzaa lasts 7 days, December 26th to January 1st, with each day dedicated to one of the 7 principles of Kwanzaa, which are unity, self-determination, collective work and responsibility, cooperative economics, purpose, creativity, and faith. And faith kind of brings us into our next fun fact. Kwanzaa is not a religious ceremony. Kwanzaa is a cultural holiday and it's not tied to any religion. So it can be celebrated by people of various faiths. You don't have to be Christian, you don't have to be Muslim, you don't have to be anything to celebrate Kwanzaa. It's all inclusive. Our next fun fact is that the kinara or candle holder is central to Kwanzaa celebration. It holds a black candle, which symbolizes the African people, 3 red candles, which represents their struggles, and 3 green candles, which signify hope for the future. Our next fun fact is that Kwanzaa includes gifts. They're particularly between parents and children to promote personal growth, creativity, and the connection to African heritage. Our next fact is that Dr. Karenga added an extra A onto Kwanzaa. The original Swahili word Kwanzaa, Kwanza, has only 1 A, but an extra A was added to ensure that Kwanzaa's name had 7 letters, aligning with the theme of 7 principles. I thought that was really cool. And our last fun fact is that Kwanzaa is a time for reflection and growth. It's not only about celebration, but also about reflection. It encourages individuals to look at how they contribute to their families, communities, and cultural identities. So why did I pick today's topic? Number one, it's a holiday thing. But beyond that, it's something that is really special. It's a moment in the midst of war and death and tragedy where soldiers crawled out of their literal trenches believing in the humanity of their enemies, trusting in the humanity of their enemies. And like I said, I haven't been hit with the warm, delightful Christmas spirit this year. I don't want to put a flag out there like I'm depressed or like I'm in trouble. So don't take it that way. I'm not in peril right now, but I'm just not feeling that warm, fuzzy Christmas spirit that I feel like a lot of us aren't. And I'm also not over here being a Grinch or a Scrooge. I'm not saying don't experience Christmas and all of these holidays that happen this time of year with your whole heart. If you're feeling it, dive in, cannonball, just let it envelop you and consume you and be one with it. I think everyone deserves to feel happy and feel safe and feel warm, but I just haven't been hit with it super hard yet. I think a lot of that, like I said earlier, has to do with the state of the world right now. The wars and the tragedies and all that, it just feels twisted and mangled and emotionally too. It's a twisted time of year, it's a mangled time of year. There's a lot of pain and grief that bubble to the surface for a lot of people, for most people this time of year, because you think about your loved ones, you think about people who aren't with us anymore, and you think about you get like this retrospective. You start to have a retrospective on your year, and this gives you a retrospective on your life. And a lot of these really intense emotions can come to the surface. But in the midst of all this, and in the just insanity of, of all this, I think that we have to remember that in the dark places, we can be a light. And even though things can seem incredibly dark sometimes, there is a beautiful strength in not letting our flames go out, in sharing the warmth of the fire and the light in our hearts. Even when it's cold and feels dark and bleak, there's a strength in shining. I won't keep you any longer. I hope you have a wonderful holiday, however you celebrate. Remember to check on your mental health And remember to check on the mental health of your loved ones. Bye.
Thoughts. Analog thoughts.
Analog thoughts.
Analog thoughts. Analog thoughts.
Analog thoughts.
Analog thoughts.
Analog thoughts.